Misogynistic judge ignores woman's plea. What she does next shocks the courtroom. The courtroom was packed. Rows of benches were filled with spectators whispering among themselves, some casting curious glances at the woman standing at the plaintiff's table. Sarah Morgan, a petite yet poised figure, stood with her hands gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles pale from the pressure. Her heart raced, but her expression was resolute. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves coursing through her. "I have provided substantial evidence that my business was deliberately targeted. My competitor, Mr. Langston, sabotaged my company by spreading false information to my clients and bribing suppliers to cut ties with me." Judge Harold Porter leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. His eyes, hooded and bored, scanned the documents in front of him with feigned interest. He sighed, loud enough for everyone to hear, and then glanced at Sarah over the rim of his glasses. "Miss Morgan," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "this is a courtroom, not a therapy session. We're here to deal with facts, not feelings. If your business failed, perhaps you should look in the mirror instead of blaming others." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sarah felt her face flush, but she refused to let the judge's words intimidate her. She straightened her posture and gestured toward the stack of documents on the table. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said firmly, "the evidence I've presented is not based on feelings. These are financial records, email correspondences, and signed affidavits from former employees of Mr. Langston's company, all of which support my claims." Judge Porter waved a dismissive hand, cutting her off. "I've reviewed your so-called evidence, Miss Morgan, and I find it lacking. This is a business matter, not a criminal one. If you couldn't compete in the marketplace, that's hardly Mr. Langston's fault." Sarah clenched her jaw, her frustration boiling beneath the surface. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, some sympathetic, others doubtful. Beside her, her attorney, David, leaned in and whispered, "Stay calm, Sarah. Don't let him get under your skin." But staying calm was easier said than done. Sarah had spent months gathering evidence and preparing for this day. She had poured her heart and soul into building her business, only to watch it crumble under the weight of Langston's underhanded tactics. And now, the one person who was supposed to ensure justice was mocking her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice rising slightly, "this case isn't just about my business. It's about holding people accountable for their actions. If we allow individuals like Mr. Langston to manipulate the system without consequences, what message does that send to others?" Judge Porter smirked, leaning forward and steepling his fingers. "Miss Morgan, I'll tell you what message it sends. It tells people to toughen up. Business isn't for the faint of heart, and sometimes you have to accept that not everyone can succeed." The courtroom fell silent. Sarah's attorney opened his mouth to object, but she placed a hand on his arm, signaling him to wait. She wasn't done yet. In the back of the courtroom, an older woman shook her head in disbelief. Next to her, a younger man whispered, "Did he really just say that? Isn't he supposed to be impartial?" The woman nodded grimly. "He's notorious for this kind of behavior. Always dismissive, especially toward women." Meanwhile, at the defense table, Mr. Langston sat with a smug grin, his attorney looking equally confident. They exchanged a glance, clearly enjoying the judge's performance. Sarah took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had expected resistance, but not outright hostility. Still, she had one last card to play, a piece of evidence she had kept in reserve, waiting for the right moment. It was risky, but she couldn't let this judge's bias derail her case. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady once more, "I have one more piece of evidence to submit. It's a recording of a conversation between Mr. Langston and one of my former suppliers." Judge Porter raised an eyebrow, his tone skeptical. "A recording? And why wasn't this included in your initial submission?" "Because, Your Honor," Sarah replied, "I obtained it only recently. And I believe it will shed light on the extent of Mr. Langston's actions." Before the judge could respond, David stood up. "Your Honor, we formally request to play the recording as evidence. It directly pertains to the plaintiff's claims and is essential for a fair trial." Judge Porter sighed theatrically, glancing at the clock on the wall. "Fine," he said, waving a hand. "But make it quick." We don't have all day. Sarah retrieved her phone from her bag, her hands shaking slightly as she connected it to the courtroom's audio system. She took a deep breath, then pressed play. The recording crackled to life, and Mr. Langston's voice filled the room. "I don't care what it takes," he said, his tone sharp and commanding. "Cut her off. Refuse her orders. If she can't get supplies, she can't fulfill her contracts. And once her clients start leaving, she'll have no choice but to shut down." There was a pause, followed by another voice, a supplier Sarah had worked with for years. "I don't feel right about this, Langston. It's dishonest." Langston's response was chilling. "You'll feel fine once the check clears. Just do what I'm paying you to do." The courtroom erupted in gasps. Even Judge Porter seemed momentarily stunned, though he quickly masked his reaction with a scowl. "Order," he barked, banging his gavel. "Order in the court." Sarah glanced at Langston, whose smug expression had vanished. His attorney leaned in, whispering urgently, but it was clear the damage had been done. Judge Porter cleared his throat, his tone colder than ever. "Miss Morgan, while this recording is compelling, it doesn't change the fact that your business failure is not a matter for this court." David immediately stood, his voice firm. "Your Honor, the recording not only proves sabotage but also suggests unethical and potentially illegal practices by the defendant. This cannot be dismissed so easily." Judge Porter glared at him, but before he could respond, Sarah spoke up. "Your Honor, there's more." The judge's patience was visibly wearing thin. "More? What more could there possibly be?" Sarah met his gaze, her own unwavering. "This isn't just about Mr. Langston. It's about you." The courtroom fell deathly silent. Even David looked startled, his eyes widening as he turned to Sarah. "Miss Morgan," Judge Porter said, his voice low and dangerous, "I suggest you tread carefully." But Sarah wasn't backing down. She reached into her bag and pulled out a second recording. "I have evidence," she said, "that Mr. Langston bribed a public official to ensure this case would be dismissed. And that official is you, Your Honor." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Spectators whispered furiously, reporters scribbled notes, and Langston's face turned ashen. Judge Porter banged his gavel repeatedly, his voice booming. "Order! I will have order!" But the damage was done. The truth was out and there was no putting it back. The courtroom buzzed with an electric intensity as Sarah's accusation hung in the air. Judge Porter's face flushed red, his gavel coming down repeatedly to silence the murmurs and gasps, but the weight of her words was impossible to suppress. "Miss Morgan," he growled, leaning forward with a glare that could freeze fire. "You are making a very serious accusation, one that could result in severe consequences for you. I suggest you reconsider your statement." Sarah stood firm, her shoulders squared. "I understand the gravity of my words, Your Honor. That's why I came prepared." She held up the second recording. This contains a conversation between Mr. Langston and another individual discussing the payments made to influence this trial. The courtroom erupted again, despite the judge's furious pounding of the gavel. Sarah's attorney, David, quickly rose to his feet, his voice cutting through the noise. "Your Honor, we request that this recording be played immediately. Given the nature of the allegations, it is imperative that the evidence be reviewed." Judge Porter's lips pressed into a thin line, his usual condescension replaced by barely restrained fury. "Miss Morgan," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "I strongly advise you to reconsider what you're doing." But Sarah didn't flinch. "I'm doing what's right." Realizing he had no choice, the judge relented. "Fine. Play the recording," he snapped, leaning back in his chair with an expression of forced indifference. Sarah connected her phone to the audio system once more, her hands steady despite the tension in the room. With a deep breath, she pressed play. The recording began with Mr. Langston's voice, clear and unmistakable. "I don't want to leave anything to chance," he said, his tone smug. "I've already spoken to Porter. He knows what's expected." The second voice, belonging to an unidentified man, responded, "You're sure he'll play ball? Judges don't like getting their hands dirty." Langston chuckled. "Trust me, he'll do whatever I need him to." I made it worth his while. By the time this case is over, Sarah Morgan will be nothing but a bad memory." The room fell into stunned silence as the recording ended. Every eye turned toward Judge Porter, whose face was now ashen. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. David seized the moment, his voice firm and unyielding. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. We demand that this case be reassigned to an impartial judge and that an immediate investigation into Mr. Langston's actions, and yours, be initiated." Judge Porter's composure finally cracked. "This is outrageous," he bellowed, slamming his gavel onto the bench. "I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus." Sarah stepped forward, her voice cutting through his bluster like a knife. "It's already a circus, Your Honor, but you're the one wearing the clown suit." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, but Sarah didn't stop. "You've belittled me, dismissed my evidence, and mocked my case from the start. And now we all know why, because you were never impartial to begin with. You sold your integrity to protect a corrupt businessman." Judge Porter shot to his feet, his hands trembling with rage. "That's enough." But before he could say more, the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open, and a pair of officers strode in. They were accompanied by a stern-looking woman in a navy blue suit, her badge gleaming on her lapel. "Judge Porter," she announced, her voice crisp and authoritative, "I'm Special Agent Karen Lister with the Department of Justice. We've received credible evidence of judicial misconduct and are here to take you into custody pending further investigation." The courtroom erupted once again, the chaos this time laced with a sense of vindication. The officers approached the bench as Judge Porter sputtered, his protests falling on deaf ears. "This is absurd. You can't do this," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I am a judge. I demand respect." Agent Lister remained unmoved. "Respect is earned, not bought," she said coldly. "And from what I've heard, you've earned none." As the officers escorted Judge Porter out of the courtroom, the tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of justice. Mr. Langston, who had been watching the scene unfold with increasing panic, tried to rise from his seat, but David quickly called out, "Your Honor, we request that Mr. Langston be detained for questioning regarding the bribery allegations." The temporary judge, who had been called to oversee the case in Porter's absence, nodded firmly. "Granted. Bailiff, take Mr. Langston into custody." Langston's smug demeanor evaporated as he was led away, his protests drowned out by the murmurs of the courtroom. Sarah sank into her chair, the adrenaline finally wearing off. David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said quietly. "You stood up to them and won." She nodded, her emotions a whirlwind of relief, exhaustion, and pride. "I couldn't let them get away with it. Not this time." In the days that followed, the fallout from the trial sent shockwaves through the legal community. News outlets ran headline after headline about the disgraced judge and the corrupt businessman who had tried to manipulate the system. Sarah's name became synonymous with courage, her story inspiring others to speak out against injustice. But for Sarah, the victory wasn't just about the headlines or the recognition. It was about reclaiming her voice and proving to herself, and the world, that standing up for what's right was always worth the risk. One afternoon, as she sat in her modest office reviewing plans to rebuild her business, she received a phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but it wasn't David. "Miss Morgan, this is Agent Lister. I wanted to thank you for your bravery in court. Without your determination, this case might never have come to light." Sarah smiled, her grip on the phone tightening. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Lister replied, her tone firm. "You did what most people are too afraid to do. And because of you, we're launching a full investigation into judicial corruption in this district." The words hit Sarah like a wave, the weight of her actions finally sinking in. "I'm glad I could help," she said softly. "You did more than help," Lister said. "You made a difference." Months later, Sarah's case was reassigned to an impartial judge, and this time, the outcome was vastly different. The court ruled in her favor, awarding her compensation for the damages caused by Langston's sabotage. With the funds, Sarah rebuilt her business from the ground up, stronger and more resilient than ever. But her journey didn't end there. Inspired by her experience, Sarah began advocating for judicial reform, speaking at events and working with organizations dedicated to holding those in power accountable. Her story became a rallying cry for change, a testament to the power of one voice standing up against corruption. On a quiet evening, Sarah stood outside her new office, the sign above the door gleaming in the twilight. Morgan & Company was back, better than ever. She took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs, and smiled. This wasn't just the end of her fight, it was the beginning of something much bigger. And as she stepped inside to greet her team, she knew one thing for certain: she had found her strength, and she wasn't letting go. The months following Sarah's victory were a whirlwind of activity and transformation. Her case became a flashpoint for public discussions about corruption in the judicial system and the unique challenges faced by women seeking justice in a system often biased against them. Media outlets clamored to interview Sarah, praising her bravery in exposing not only Mr. Langston but also Judge Porter's unethical behavior. For Sarah, however, the attention was both a blessing and a burden. She was grateful that her story had inspired so many, but she also felt the pressure of being in the spotlight. Every time she turned on the news or opened her email, there were new requests for interviews, speaking engagements, or collaborations with advocacy groups. Despite the chaos, she remained focused on her goals, rebuilding her business and ensuring that her victory would spark lasting change. One of the most significant moments came when she was invited to testify before a congressional committee investigating judicial corruption. Sarah knew this was an opportunity to shine a light on the systemic issues that had allowed Judge Porter and others like him to abuse their power. As she prepared for her testimony, David, her attorney and now close friend, offered his unwavering support. "This is your chance to make a real impact," he said. "You've already changed so much, but this could take it to another level." Sarah nodded, her determination evident. "I'm ready," she said. "People need to know the truth." On the day of the hearing, the room was packed with lawmakers, journalists, and members of the public. Sarah sat at the witness table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, as cameras flashed and murmurs filled the air. When the chairman called her name, she rose and took the oath, her heart pounding but her expression calm. "Thank you for having me here today," she began, her voice steady. "I'm here not just to tell my story, but to speak for everyone who has been silenced by a system that prioritizes power over justice." She recounted her experience in vivid detail: the sabotage of her business, the dismissal of her evidence, and the shocking revelation of Judge Porter's corruption. As she spoke, the room grew silent, her words resonating with everyone present. "This isn't just about one bad judge or one dishonest businessman," Sarah continued. "It's about a culture that allows people like them to operate with impunity. We need accountability, transparency, and reform. Otherwise, stories like mine will keep happening." When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Several lawmakers approached her afterward, thanking her for her courage and promising to use her testimony as a foundation for legislative changes. For the first time, Sarah felt like she was truly making a difference on a larger scale. Meanwhile, Sarah's business, Morgan & Company, was flourishing. The compensation she had received from the lawsuit allowed her to invest in new projects and hire a team of talented individuals who shared her vision. But what truly set her company apart was its commitment to ethical practices and community engagement. Sarah launched a mentorship program for young entrepreneurs, particularly women, providing them with the resources and guidance they needed to succeed. She also partnered with nonprofit organizations to support small businesses that had been affected by unfair practices or systemic inequities. One of her ments, a young woman named Jasmine, reminded Sarah of herself. Jasmine had started a catering business but had struggled to compete against larger companies with more resources. Through Sarah's mentorship program, Jasmine learned how to market her services effectively, secure funding, and build a loyal client base. At a company event celebrating their successes, Jasmine approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You've changed my life." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You changed your life, Jasmine. I just gave you the tools to do it. As Sarah's influence grew, so did the reach of her advocacy work. She joined forces with national organizations dedicated to fighting corruption and promoting gender equity, using her platform to amplify the voices of those who had been marginalized. She spoke at conferences, participated in panels, and even wrote a book titled Breaking the Silence: My Fight for Justice. The book became a bestseller, praised for its raw honesty and powerful message. In it, Sarah detailed her journey from a struggling business owner to a symbol of resilience and reform. She shared not only the challenges she had faced but also the lessons she had learned along the way. Standing up for what's right isn't easy, she wrote in the book's conclusion. But it's always worth it. Because when we fight for justice, we're not just fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for everyone who comes after us. Despite her busy schedule, Sarah made time to visit her hometown, where her journey had begun. Walking through the streets that had once felt so small, she reflected on how far she had come. The local coffee shop, where she had spent countless hours working on her business plans, now displayed her book in the front window, alongside a handwritten note that read, "Our hometown hero." As she stepped inside, the barista recognized her immediately. "Sarah Morgan?" she said, her eyes wide. "It's really you?" Sarah laughed, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "It's me." The barista hurried to make her a latte, refusing to let her pay. "Your story inspired so many of us," she said as she handed Sarah the cup. "Thank you for showing us what's possible." Sarah smiled, her heart full. "Thank you for believing in me." Later that day, Sarah visited the courthouse where her case had been heard. The building, once a symbol of frustration and injustice, now represented something entirely different. Judge Porter had been disbarred and was facing criminal charges, while Mr. Langston's business empire had crumbled under the weight of multiple lawsuits and investigations. Standing on the courthouse steps, Sarah felt a sense of closure. The fight wasn't over, there was still so much work to be done, but she knew she had made a lasting impact. As she turned to leave, a young woman approached her hesitantly. "Miss Morgan," she said, clutching a notebook to her chest. "I just wanted to say thank you. Your story gave me the courage to stand up to my boss when he was treating me unfairly." Sarah placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, her eyes filled with warmth. "You're stronger than you know," she said. "Never stop standing up for yourself." In the years that followed, Sarah's legacy continued to grow. Her business thrived, her advocacy work expanded, and her story inspired countless others to speak out against injustice. She became a sought-after advisor for companies and governments alike, helping to implement policies that promoted fairness, accountability, and equality. Through it all, Sarah remained grounded, never forgetting the journey that had brought her to this point. She often thought about that pivotal day in the courtroom, when she had faced down a corrupt judge and a powerful businessman with nothing but her courage and conviction. And every time she thought about it, she smiled. Because she knew that in standing up for herself, she had helped create a world where others could do the same. As the years passed, Sarah Morgan became a beacon of hope and resilience, her story reaching corners of the world she never imagined. Her journey from being dismissed in court to reshaping the system that had failed her was the kind of transformation that inspired headlines, documentaries, and countless people who had once felt powerless. But Sarah didn't let the spotlight distract her from her mission. She remained laser-focused on her dual goals: ensuring fairness in the legal system and empowering small business owners, especially women, to thrive in a competitive world. One bright morning, Sarah stood in front of a packed conference hall in New York City. The event, Voices for Change, brought together activists, policymakers, and business leaders from around the globe. Sarah had been invited to deliver the keynote address, and as she looked out at the sea of expectant faces, she felt a familiar surge of nerves, quickly followed by determination. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady and clear. "When I stood in that courtroom years ago, I felt small. I felt powerless. But I also felt something else, a spark. A belief that no matter how broken the system seemed, it could be fixed if enough people stood together and demanded change." She paused, scanning the crowd. What I didn't realize then was how many others felt the same way. People who had faced injustice, who had been silenced, who were waiting for someone, anyone, to show them that change was possible. Sarah shared the lessons she had learned along the way, the importance of perseverance, the power of community, and the necessity of holding those in power accountable. Her speech was met with a standing ovation, and as she left the stage, she was approached by numerous attendees eager to collaborate. Back at home, Sarah found herself reflecting on how far she had come. Her office walls were lined with photos and mementos from her journey, a framed copy of her court victory, a group photo with the team at Morgan & Company, and a collage of letters from people whose lives she had touched. One letter, in particular, caught her eye. It was from a woman named Carla, who had written to thank Sarah for inspiring her to fight back against workplace discrimination. "Because of you," the letter read, "I found the courage to speak up. I won my case, and now I'm working to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." Sarah smiled as she reread the letter. It was a reminder that her fight had always been about more than herself. It was about creating ripples of change that could reach far beyond what she could see. Meanwhile, Morgan & Company had grown into a thriving enterprise with a reputation for integrity and innovation. Sarah's mentorship program had produced a new generation of entrepreneurs, many of whom credited her with giving them the confidence and tools to succeed. One of her ments, a single mother named Vanessa, had started a sustainable fashion brand that had quickly gained traction. At a company event, Vanessa approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "None of this would have happened without you," Vanessa said. "You believed in me when no one else did." Sarah shook her head, her voice warm. "You did the work, Vanessa. I just gave you a nudge." Vanessa smiled. "Still, I hope I can be half as inspiring to others as you've been to me." Even as Sarah celebrated these successes, she knew the fight for justice was far from over. Reports of judicial corruption and systemic bias continued to surface, reminding her that progress was a constant effort. Determined to address these issues on a larger scale, she began working with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in the legal system. One of the key proposals was the creation of an independent oversight body to investigate complaints against judges. Sarah worked tirelessly to rally support for the initiative, meeting with policymakers, legal experts, and community leaders to build a coalition. At a hearing on the proposed legislation, Sarah delivered a passionate testimony. "The integrity of our legal system is the foundation of our democracy," she said. "When that integrity is compromised, it's not just the individuals involved who suffer, it's all of us. We must ensure that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." Her testimony was instrumental in garnering bipartisan support for the bill, which was eventually signed into law. The passage of the legislation was hailed as a landmark achievement, and Sarah was praised for her unwavering commitment to justice. Despite her public success, Sarah remained deeply connected to her roots. She frequently returned to her hometown, where she continued to mentor local business owners and support community initiatives. One day, while visiting the coffee shop that had displayed her book, she struck up a conversation with the barista, a young woman named Ellie. Ellie shared that she had dreams of opening her own bakery but didn't know where to start. "It just feels so overwhelming," she admitted. "I don't even know if it's possible." Sarah smiled, recognizing the uncertainty in Ellie's voice. "It's more than possible," she said. "The hardest part is taking the first step. But once you do, you'll be amazed at what you can accomplish." Over the next few months, Sarah worked closely with Ellie, helping her develop a business plan and secure funding. When Ellie's bakery finally opened, it quickly became a beloved fixture in the community, known for its delicious pastries and welcoming atmosphere. At the bakery's grand opening, Ellie gave a heartfelt speech, thanking Sarah for her guidance. "She didn't just help me start a business," Ellie said. "She showed me that I could believe in myself." As Sarah stood among the crowd that day, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Her journey had taken her from a moment of despair to a lifetime of purpose. And while the road had been long and often difficult, she wouldn't have changed a thing. Years later, when Sarah was asked in an interview what she considered her greatest accomplishment, she didn't hesitate. "It's not the awards or the headlines," she said. "It's the people." Every person I've been able to help, every life that's been changed, that's what matters most." The interviewer smiled. "And what's next for Sarah Morgan?" Sarah's eyes twinkled with determination. "The road ahead is always full of possibilities. I plan to keep fighting for justice, lifting others up, and creating a world where everyone has a fair shot. Because there's always more work to be done." And with that, Sarah Morgan continued her journey, her story a testament to the power of resilience, courage, and the belief that one person truly can make a difference. The years passed, and Sarah Morgan's influence only grew. Her fight against corruption had become a movement, one that inspired countless others to stand up against injustice in their own lives. Yet despite her growing fame, Sarah remained humble, always remembering the moment in that courtroom when she had decided to take a stand, regardless of the consequences. Her work had brought her into contact with a diverse range of people, from lawmakers and judges to grassroots activists and everyday citizens. Each new connection reinforced her belief that change was possible, but only if people were willing to fight for it. One day, Sarah received an invitation to deliver a speech at a prestigious global summit on justice and equity. Held in Geneva, Switzerland, the summit brought together world leaders, human rights activists, and legal experts to discuss how to create fairer, more transparent systems of governance. As she boarded the plane, Sarah felt a mix of excitement and nerves. The summit was a far cry from her small-town courtroom battle, but she knew her story had a place on this stage. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could ripple out to create profound change. When she took the stage, the audience fell silent, their attention fixed on her. Sarah began by recounting her journey, describing the fear and frustration she had felt when she realized the system was stacked against her. "But that moment of despair," she said, her voice steady, "was also a moment of clarity. I realized that if I didn't stand up for myself, no one else would. And in standing up, I discovered that I wasn't alone. There were others, thousands, millions, who were just as hungry for change." She spoke about the importance of accountability, the need for systemic reform, and the power of individuals to make a difference. Her words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom gave her a standing ovation when she finished. After the speech, Sarah was approached by representatives from several international organizations. They wanted her input on initiatives ranging from judicial reform to economic empowerment for women. Sarah agreed to collaborate, eager to broaden the scope of her work. Back in the United States, Sarah continued to juggle her various responsibilities. Her business, Morgan & Company, had become a model of ethical entrepreneurship, and her foundation for judicial reform was gaining traction in state legislatures across the country. One of the foundation's most significant victories came when it successfully lobbied for the creation of a nationwide database to track complaints and disciplinary actions against judges. The database, which was publicly accessible, was hailed as a major step toward transparency and accountability in the legal system. For Sarah, this achievement was deeply personal. She knew how many people had been silenced or dismissed by corrupt judges like Porter, and she was determined to ensure that their voices would no longer go unheard. Despite her packed schedule, Sarah always made time for the people who had supported her along the way. One evening, she hosted a dinner at her home, inviting her closest friends, colleagues, and mentor to celebrate their shared successes. Among the guests was David, her attorney and longtime confidant. As they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the city, David turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "You've done so much, Sarah," he said. "Do you ever stop and think about what's next?" Sarah smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "All the time," she admitted. "But the truth is, there's always more to do. I don't think I'll ever stop fighting for what's right." David nodded, his respect for her evident. "The world's better for it. But don't forget to take care of yourself, too." Sarah laughed softly. "I'll try. But you know me. I'm happiest when I'm working toward something." Not long after, Sarah received a letter that would change the trajectory of her work yet again. It was from a young woman named Lily, who had read Sarah's book and felt inspired to share her own story. Lily wrote about how she had been wrongfully terminated from her job after speaking out against harassment. Despite overwhelming evidence in her favor, the judge assigned to her case had dismissed it without explanation. Lily felt defeated and unsure of what to do next, but reading Sarah's story had given her hope. "Your courage gave me the strength to keep fighting," Lily wrote. "I don't know if I'll win, but at least I'll know I tried." The letter struck a chord with Sarah. She reached out to Lily, offering her guidance and connecting her with legal resources. Over the next few months, Sarah worked closely with Lily, helping her prepare for an appeal. When Lily finally won her case, the victory felt as personal to Sarah as her own. Inspired by Lily's story, Sarah decided to launch a new initiative focused on providing support for individuals navigating legal battles. The program, called Justice for All, offered free legal advice, financial assistance, and emotional support to people who might otherwise be unable to access justice. The initiative quickly gained traction, with hundreds of volunteers signing up to offer their expertise. Sarah's foundation partnered with law schools, nonprofit organizations, and even private law firms to expand the program's reach. One of the program's first success stories involved a single father named Marcus, who had been fighting for custody of his daughter. Despite being a loving and capable parent, Marcus had been sidelined by a biased judge who favored the child's mother without considering the evidence. Through Justice for All, Marcus was connected with a pro bono attorney who helped him present a compelling case. When the court finally ruled in his favor, Marcus broke down in tears, grateful for the second chance to be a father. At a press conference celebrating the program's early successes, Sarah spoke passionately about the importance of equal access to justice. "No one should have to face the legal system alone," she said. "Together, we can ensure that every voice is heard, no matter how small." As Sarah's influence continued to grow, so did the challenges she faced. Critics accused her of being too idealistic, arguing that systemic change was impossible. Others questioned her motives, suggesting that her high profile was more about personal ambition than genuine reform. But Sarah refused to let the negativity deter her. She knew that change was messy and that progress was often met with resistance. Instead of focusing on the critics, she poured her energy into the people who believed in her vision. One of those people was Jack, a retired judge who had become a mentor to Sarah during her fight for judicial reform. Over lunch one day, Jack offered her a piece of advice that would stay with her for years. "Change doesn't happen all at once," he said. "It's like planting seeds. You may not see the results right away, but if you keep tending to them, one day they'll grow into something beautiful." Sarah smiled, his words resonating deeply. "Thank you, Jack. I needed to hear that." Years later, Sarah found herself once again standing in a courtroom, not as a plaintiff, but as an advocate. She had been invited to deliver a statement during a landmark trial involving widespread judicial corruption. As she spoke, she felt a sense of déjà vu, remembering the day she had faced Judge Porter and refused to back down. "This system is not perfect," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "But it can be better. It must be better. And it starts with each of us holding ourselves and each other accountable." When she finished, the room erupted in applause, a powerful reminder that her fight was far from over. As Sarah left the courtroom that day, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still long, but she was ready for the journey. After all, she had learned long ago that the fight for justice was never truly over. It was a path she would walk for the rest of her life. The passage of time only deepened Sarah Morgan's resolve to create meaningful change. Her foundation, Justice for All, had grown into a national network of support, helping thousands of people who had been wronged by a biased legal system. The initiative's impact was undeniable, but Sarah wasn't ready to rest. She knew that while they had made strides, the roots of systemic injustice ran deep, and there was still so much work to be done. One afternoon, Sarah received an invitation that both surprised and intrigued her. It was from a prestigious law school, asking her to deliver their commencement address. The invitation came with a personal note from the dean: "Your story has inspired a new generation of legal minds. We would be honored if you would share your wisdom with our graduates." Sarah accepted, though she couldn't help but feel a touch of imposter syndrome. She wasn't a lawyer or a judge, yet here she was, being asked to speak to the next wave of legal professionals. Still, she knew the importance of her message, and she wanted to inspire these young graduates to enter their field with integrity and courage. The commencement ceremony was held in a grand auditorium, packed with students, faculty, and proud families. Sarah stood backstage, reviewing her notes one last time. When her name was announced, the audience erupted in applause, a standing ovation greeting her before she even began. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped up to the podium. She looked out at the sea of faces, all eager and hopeful, and began to speak. "Congratulations to the class of 20XX, she started, her voice warm and steady. "Today marks the culmination of years of hard work, late nights, and sacrifices. You've earned this moment, and you should be proud." She paused, letting the room settle before continuing. "But as you step into the world beyond these walls, I want to remind you of something. The power you now hold is immense. As legal professionals, you have the ability to shape lives, to influence decisions, and to uphold the principles of justice. That power is a privilege, but it's also a responsibility." Sarah went on to share her own journey, from the courtroom where she had first encountered corruption to the work she was doing now. She spoke about the importance of empathy, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. "When I stood in that courtroom years ago, I felt small," she admitted. "But I realized something important. The fight for justice doesn't start in grand gestures. It starts in small acts of courage. In asking questions, in refusing to accept the unacceptable, in standing firm when it matters most." Her speech was met with thunderous applause, and as she left the stage, dozens of students approached her, thanking her for her words and expressing their determination to carry her message into their own careers. As Sarah left the ceremony, she couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since her own courtroom battle. Back then, she had been a lone voice, fighting against a system that seemed impenetrable. Now, she was part of a movement, surrounded by people who shared her vision and were working alongside her to make it a reality. But with success came new challenges. The larger her platform grew, the more scrutiny she faced. Critics accused her of being naive, of oversimplifying complex issues, or of seeking attention rather than real solutions. Sarah met these criticisms with grace, understanding that they were part of the territory. Still, there were moments when the negativity weighed on her. One such moment came during a televised debate, where she faced off against a prominent lawyer who argued that her initiatives were unrealistic and unsustainable. "Ms. Morgan," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "your passion is admirable, but the legal system is far too complex to be fixed with feel-good initiatives and idealistic rhetoric. Don't you think you're overselling the impact of your work?" Sarah remained calm, her expression thoughtful. "I understand your skepticism," she replied. "Change is hard, and it doesn't happen overnight. But dismissing efforts like mine as idealistic rhetoric ignores the real lives that have been impacted. The people who have found justice through our programs, the communities that have come together to demand accountability, these aren't abstract concepts. They're tangible results." The audience erupted into applause, and the lawyer's smug demeanor faltered. Sarah's response became a viral moment, a reminder that her fight wasn't just about ideas, it was about people. As the years went on, Sarah's foundation expanded internationally, partnering with organizations in other countries to address corruption and promote access to justice. She traveled extensively, meeting with activists, lawyers, and policymakers to share best practices and learn from their experiences. One of the most memorable trips took her to South Africa, where she visited a community legal clinic that had been inspired by her work. The clinic's director, a young woman named Thandi, welcomed Sarah with open arms and showed her around the modest but bustling facility. "Your story gave us hope," Thandi said as they walked through the clinic. "It reminded us that even the most broken systems can be rebuilt, piece by piece." Sarah was deeply moved by the work being done at the clinic. She spent hours listening to the stories of people who had found justice through its services, from a farmer whose land had been wrongfully seized to a mother fighting for her children's education. Before leaving, Sarah addressed the clinic's staff and volunteers, thanking them for their dedication and resilience. "You are proof that change is possible," she said. Keep fighting, keep believing, and know that your work matters more than you can imagine. Back home, Sarah continued to focus on the next steps for her foundation. One of her biggest goals was to create a scholarship program for aspiring lawyers from underrepresented communities, ensuring that the next generation of legal professionals reflected the diversity of the people they served. The scholarship program, named the Justice for All Fellowship, quickly gained support from donors and partners. Its first cohort included students from a wide range of backgrounds, all of whom shared a commitment to using their legal education to make a difference. At the program's launch event, Sarah spoke about the importance of investing in the future. The fight for justice is ongoing, she said. But by equipping the next generation with the tools they need to succeed, we can ensure that the progress we've made will continue to grow. Despite her many achievements, Sarah remained deeply connected to her roots. She often visited her hometown, spending time with the small businesses she had helped and mentoring young entrepreneurs. She also made a point of revisiting the courthouse where her journey had begun, now a symbol of how far she had come. One day, while sitting on the courthouse steps, Sarah was approached by a young girl clutching a worn copy of her book. The girl's eyes were wide with excitement as she introduced herself. "Hi, Miss Morgan," she said shyly. "My name is Emma. I want to be a lawyer someday, just like the people in your book." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You can be anything you want to be, Emma. Just remember to always stand up for what's right." Emma nodded, her determination clear. "I will." As Sarah watched Emma walk away, she felt a sense of fulfillment that words couldn't capture. Her journey had been long and often difficult, but it had led her to this moment. A moment where she could see the impact of her work in the lives of others. And though she knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, Sarah was ready to face them. Because she believed more than ever that the fight for justice was worth every step.